Oh man! So one of the top economists in the United States, Niall Ferguson, has said that inflation could repeat the 1960s spiral when the Fed lost control of inflation. And the subsequent, if you remember, in the 70s and 80s, inflation hit about 12-13% in the 70s and got as high as kind of 14-15% in the 80s. And we're going to take a look at that right now. Let's see what Ferguson has said in his article. So the US Federal Reserve and many economists maintain that the recent spike in inflation will be transitory, but Ferguson called this into question. So he says inflation could be repeating the trajectory of the late 1960s, which laid the foundation for sustained high inflation the following decade. So he's saying it was in the 1960s, and I'm going to show you shortly, when the Fed lost control. And he's saying that's what led to the 70s and 80s, the peaks we saw in inflation, where it really skyrocketed. So he says, as a result of responding to the COVID-19 pandemic in a similar fashion to the global financial crisis of 2008, policymakers were now facing a new challenge in the form of rising inflation. Yep, so we know we've had a bunch of printing. We've spoke about this plenty on this channel. We've covered the Jerome Powell remarks. We've done a lot of printing, and that can create pressure on inflation. So what does he say? What is interesting about disasters is that one can lead to another. You can go from a public health disaster to a fiscal, monetary, and potentially inflationary disaster. So he's saying these things, if you look at history, always connect. It can start from a war and it can trigger into fiscal, because obviously then you need to stimulate with fiscal, you loosen your monetary, and then before you know it, you then hit inflation. This is the loop that repeats time and time again, and that's what Niall Ferguson is pointing out right now. He's saying it's not such a big disaster because it doesn't kill people, but inflation liftoff would still be a problem, and we know that is a problem. Obviously, the first problem has to be averted of the people suffering from this illness, but this is the secondary pain point in terms of inflation, which also has an effect on poorer communities. US consumer prices rose 5.4% in July, March, I think that's supposed to be matching the largest jump since August 2008. Yep, we've covered that. Now, we know that the Fed have always said it's transitory, and Ferguson calls this into question as well. So he says, how long is transitory? At what point do expectations fundamentally shift, especially if the Federal Reserve is telling people we have changed our inflation target regime and we don't mind if inflation goes above target for a while, okay? So this is his concern. He's saying, oh, look, the Fed is saying we've changed our target and we don't mind if it goes up above for a while. So when do you acknowledge that you've lost control? Because you're just saying, oh, I don't mind if it goes above our target. At what point do you say you've lost control of it? It's funny because Jerome Powell covered these things in his remarks as well. He referred to the 60s and the 70s, and he spoke about these, and we covered this on the channel after his remarks. He spoke about the double-edged sword that he faces. If you react too quickly with the taper right now, it could have a lag effect and it could cause the wrong issue, because if the economy is fixing itself, i.e. it's transitory, and then you apply the fix when we've already fixed the issue, then you're going to create an even worse situation. But then he reminded us of the 70s, which is where CPI was going high, but he felt that core CPI continued to go up even after the energy prices, which were transitory, started to recover. And that's the situation we could have here, because what if it creates a self-fulfilling prophecy? Because if consumers believe inflation is going to go up, then they will then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It can go up. They'll start behaving as it does, and then that will cause that loop to go around. So this is what Ferguson says. My sense is that we are not heading for the 1970s yet, but we could be running the late 1960s. This is going to make sense to you when I chart it shortly. When famously the Fed chair then, McChesney Martin, lost control of inflation expectations. Okay? His comments come after former IMF chief economist and Harvard professor of public, Kenneth Rogers, suggested in an article earlier this week that the US withdrawal from Afghanistan has added to the list of unsettling parallels between the 20s and the 70s. So this is really interesting. So let's take a look at this chart. This is the US CPI reading in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So what he's referring to is here in the late 60s. So you can see here inflation's under control. You can see it under the 2%. And here, in the late 60s, you start to get a climb out of the 2% bracket. You get a 4% reading there. And then going into your 70s, we then tank up to 6%. So he's defining this is the period we lost control. And then look at what happened in subsequent decades. In around 1975, you topped 12%. And then in the 1980s, at the early 80s, you topped almost 15% before it had a correction back down. So this is the worrying sign that Niall Ferguson is referring to. He's saying there's a melting pot of different things which are going on. You've had your pandemic, which has been tried to, Fed have tried to control the issues using fiscal and monetary policy, but that is leading to potentially losing control of inflation. Now, also what's adding to this concern is you've had the data releases of the house prices, which show the house prices rose 19% year on year. Former Treasury Larry Summers then said, every time you hear that inflation is transitory, just remember that the house price inflation hasn't hit the CPI readings yet. And he's saying that CPI, it consists of 40% housing, which is right. And then finally, it gets quite dark at the end because Ferguson then goes on to say, the big inflations in history have nearly always been associated with war. The thing that would really de-anchor inflation expectations would be if this Cold War between the United States and China escalated into a hot war, say over Taiwan. So what he says is, Ferguson speculated that in the light of US withdrawal from Afghanistan, President Xi may see the emerging American reluctance over military conflict as an opportunity to seize control of Taiwan. Very interesting. So, to summarize, what is Niall Ferguson saying? He's saying if you look back at history, you've had a non-economic event, such as a pandemic or a war, which has been addressed with fiscal and monetary response, which is what we've seen, that to some extent fix the issue, i.e. solving the immediate issue, but can create a long-term loss of control in inflation. Now, people say, and the Fed is saying, Jerome Powell is saying this is transitory, but where is the evidence that this is transitory? Even Jerome Powell himself acknowledged that the last time in the 70s when we thought it was transitory, the core reading continued to go up afterwards because it created almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, then the worrying thing is that any massive peaks in inflation to, in the 70s and in the 70s and 80s, which we just looked at, getting to 12% and 15%, is tied in with war. And the backdrop of what's going on in Afghanistan, if you want to get into a political realm, is then saying, what if President Xi sees this as an opportunity to seize control of Taiwan? At that point, the US would be forced into a decision to either cede global dominance or go for another distant war. And then what will that do for inflation? I mean, so this is really, from an economic point of view, creating a kind of the worst type of melting pot you would want for high inflation. And all the variables are there, all the ingredients are there for high inflation. And perhaps this is why Jerome Powell is reluctant to announce taper just yet, and he's holding off, even though certain metrics may be ticking his way. So there you go, guys. That is an update from Niall Ferguson, one of the most renowned economists in the US. And he's saying that the Fed could be losing control of inflation. So September 13th, we're going to get our next CPI reading. No doubt we'll cover it on this channel. It's going to be a really important one. We get our jobs figures in a couple of hours. Also, those are the two data points that Fed Chairman Jerome Powell will be using to make his decision on taper or not when the Fed convene on the 22nd of September later this month. So there you go, guys. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.